The hands that would be nailed tomorrow were tearing bread tonight, thin, flat bread, so pale it almost glowed in the lamplight, held between fingers still dusty from the road, cracked along the scored lines as easily as a promise breaks, and offered to men who did not yet understand what they were receiving. That sound, the soft fracture of unleavened dough, was the first word of a new covenant, and the room where it happened looked nothing like the painting you have carried in your mind your entire life. Forget the long table, forget the chairs, forget the bright open hall with its Renaissance arches and its 13 men sitting upright in a row like guests at a banquet painted for a duke's dining wall. Leonardo da Vinci gave the world a masterpiece in 1498, but he gave it the wrong room, the wrong furniture, the wrong posture, and the wrong light. What actually happened that Thursday evening in Jerusalem, what the Greek text describes, what the archaeology confirms, what the Mishnah preserves in meticulous detail, is stranger, more intimate, and more devastating than anything a 15th century Italian imagination could produce. It was the 14th of Nisan. The year was 33 AD, and the city was breathing like a living thing. Jerusalem, in the days before Passover, became a pressure vessel. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, who had no reason to exaggerate for Christian purposes, recorded that approximately 500 lambs were slaughtered at the temple during a single Passover festival, each shared among groups of 10 to 20 pilgrims. Do the arithmetic, and the number of people flooding a city built for perhaps 40,000 swells past 250,000. Every rooftop became a kitchen, every courtyard became a dining hall. The smoke of roasting meat rose from every quarter, and the streets were so dense with bodies that moving through them required the patience of water finding its way through stone. Somewhere in the upper city, the wealthy southwestern hill where priestly families and aristocrats kept their fine homes, a room had been prepared. Luke's Gospel calls it an anagaion mega, a large upper room, furnished and ready. Mark uses nearly identical language. These were not vague descriptions. In the 1970s, the Israeli archaeologist Nachman Avigad excavated that very neighborhood, now the Jewish quarter of the Old City, and uncovered Herodian-era mansions with rooms stretching 65 square meters, their walls still bearing traces of frescoes, their floors still holding fragments of mosaic, their courtyard still ringed with mikvaot, the ritual immersion baths that marked a household as observant. Fine stone tableware, carved stone vessels chosen precisely because stone, unlike ceramic, could not become ritually impure. This was not a peasant's attic. The room Jesus sent Peter and John to prepare was a room of consequence in a home of means, offered by someone whose name the Gospels do not record, but whose generosity sheltered the most important meal in history. Peter and John had been given strange instructions that morning. Follow a man carrying a water jar. In a world where women carried water and men did not, the signal was unmistakable, as conspicuous as a flare. They found him, followed him, and when they arrived at the house, the room was already furnished. The Greek word Mark uses is estromenon, spread with cushions, prepared for reclining. Because nobody sat at this meal, nobody sat at any formal Jewish meal in the first century. The verb Mark uses when the supper begins is anakimenon, reclining, and John, in the most intimate detail of the entire evening, describes the beloved disciple as anakimenos en to kolpo, leaning back against the chest of Jesus. You cannot lean against someone's chest if you are sitting in a chair across a table. You can only do it if you are lying on your left side on a cushioned couch, with your head at table height, and the person behind you close enough that tilting backward brings your head to rest against their heart. The arrangement was a triclinium, 3 couches forming a U-shape around a low central table that stood no more than 30 or 40 centimeters off the ground, feet extended outward, away from the food, which is why a woman could approach from behind and wash a reclining man's feet without crossing in front of anyone. The positions carried meaning. The host reclined at the left end of the center couch. The seat of highest honor was to the host's immediate left, the place where a guest could lean backward into the host's chest. The second most honored position was to the host's right, close enough for private conversation, close enough for the passing of food hand to hand, close enough for a whispered exchange that no one else could hear. John was at Jesus' left, the beloved disciple resting against the heartbeat of God. And Judas, scholars believe, was at Jesus' right, in the place of the trusted friend, close enough that when Jesus dipped a morsel and handed it to him, the gesture was invisible to most of the room, close enough that the intimacy of the betrayal was total. The host placed the traitor at his right hand. That is not the act of a man who was caught off guard. That is the act of someone who knew exactly what was coming and chose to offer honor to the one who would destroy him. Think about that for a moment. Think about the last time someone wounded you, and ask yourself whether you would have seated them at your right hand and served them first from your own dish. The room itself would have been warm, not from heating. There was no fire. The Passover preparation forbade it as the Sabbath approached, but from bodies. 13 men reclining on cushions in a closed space. The heat of oil lamps adding their small contribution to the closeness, and there would have been many lamps. The Herodian oil lamps archaeologists have pulled from Jerusalem's soil are small things, 7 to 10 centimeters long, a single nozzle burning olive oil through a flax wick, each one producing no more than the light of 1 or 2 candles. A room this size would have needed 15 or 20 of them to push back the darkness, and even then the light would have been golden, unsteady, intimate. A light that softened faces and deepened shadows and made the space feel less like a dining room and more like the interior of a prayer, and on the low table, a feast that Leonardo never imagined. The Passover Seder followed a precise order already codified by the 1st century and preserved in the Mishnah, Tractate Pesachim, chapter 10. 4 cups of wine at specific intervals, bitter herbs, maror, likely romaine lettuce or endive, whose sharp bite was meant to recall the bitterness of slavery, charosei, a thick paste of crushed dates, nuts, apples, and wine that looked like the mortar Hebrew slaves had mixed in Egypt, sweet in the mouth but commemorating suffering. A roasted lamb shank bone, a roasted egg, karpas, a green vegetable dipped in salt water, the salt recalling tears, the green recalling the first fragile sign of hope, and matzah, the unleavened bread, 3 pieces wrapped in cloth, the middle one broken. The table would have held lentils and chickpeas, olives glistening with their own oil, figs dried to dark sweetness, sliced pomegranate bleeding crimson seeds across the plate. Archaeological food residue analysis from 1st century Jerusalem confirms all of this and more. Fish sauce similar to Roman garum, herbs in variety, dates in abundance. The colors alone would have been extraordinary. Deep reds and purples of wine, bright green of herbs, the amber of charosei, the bone white of matzah, the glistening bronze of roasted lamb. This was a table of abundance, of sensory richness, of a people celebrating their deliverance with every sense God gave them. The wine deserves its own moment, because what Jesus held in his hands that night was not what you imagine either. 1st century Jews did not drink wine the way we do. The Mishnah specifies, and 2nd Maccabees confirms, that wine was mixed with water, 2 parts water to 1 part wine, sometimes 3 to 1. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric by Jewish and Greco-Roman standards alike. The wine itself was red, pressed from grapes grown on the Judean hills. Pliny the Elder noted that Judean wines were among the notable regional varieties of the ancient world. Carbonized grape seeds from the period have been excavated at Ashkelon and across the Shephelah. What Jesus lifted and called his blood was not the deep, opaque crimson of a modern Cabernet. It was a translucent, diluted red, the color of blood mixed with water, the color that would flow from his side the next afternoon when a Roman lance opened his chest. The Seder began with the first cup, the cup of sanctification, the Kiddush, the blessing that set this night apart from all other nights. Then came the telling. The Haggadah, the retelling of the Exodus story, was already practiced in the 1st century, and the Mishnah records that the youngest person at the table was to ask the Ma Nishtana the 4 questions. Why is this night different from all other nights? At this table, the youngest may well have been John. Picture him, reclining at the place of honor, barely more than a youth, asking the ancient questions while leaning against the chest of the one who was about to answer them in a way no one in that room could have anticipated. Why is this night different from all other nights? Because on this night, the lamb would stop being a symbol and start being a person. The lamb they ate that evening had been slaughtered that afternoon at the temple, one among 250,000, killed between 3 in the afternoon and sunset. The Mishnah describes in detail how it was prepared. Roasted whole on a spit of pomegranate wood, never boiled, never stewed, the heat of the fire the only thing that touched it. The spit was thrust through the mouth and out the hindquarters, and the intestines were draped around the outside. Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century, looked at that description and stopped breathing. The lamb on the pomegranate spit, he wrote in his dialogue with Trypho, was in the form of a cross. 1 bar through the length of the body, the draped intestines forming the crossbeam. For 14 centuries, Israel had been roasting its Passover lambs in the shape of the thing that would kill the final lamb. And no one saw it until it was finished. That detail alone, the cruciform lamb, should keep you awake tonight. Not because it is clever, because it is precise. Because it means that every Passover table for over 1,000 years carried a prophecy in the shape of its centerpiece, and the prophecy was invisible until the cross made it legible. God does not shout. God hides meaning inside ritual and waits for the moment when the pattern completes itself and the design is suddenly, staggeringly obvious. Now comes the moment the world has never recovered from. During the meal, Luke specifies it was after the 2nd cup, the cup of plagues, during the eating of the unleavened bread, Jesus took the matzah. Matthew uses the Greek word artos for bread, but clarifies the timing as the first day of unleavened bread, protetonazumon, confirming that this bread was azumos, unleavened, matzah. That thin, flat, brittle bread baked in under 18 minutes to prevent any rising, scored with lines across its surface, pierced with holes to keep it from bubbling in the oven, striped and pierced. 700 years before this night, the prophet Isaiah had written of a suffering servant. By his stripes we are healed, he was pierced for our transgressions. And now the bread that commemorated Israel's deliverance, the bread of haste, the bread of no time to wait, the bread of God said go now, lay in the hands of the one Isaiah had described, and it bore the marks of his tomorrow on its surface. The stripes were already there, the piercings were already there, baked into the bread before Jesus ever touched it. He did not need to alter anything. He simply held up what was already true and said, "This is my body." Some words once spoken divide all of time into before and after. Then came the 3rd cup, the cup of redemption. In the Seder, this cup follows the meal, and it corresponds to the 3rd of God's 4 promises in Exodus chapter 6. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. Luke records it with clinical precision, the cup after supper, distinguishing it from the earlier cup he mentioned. Jesus took it, gave thanks, and said the words that Matthew preserves, "This is my blood of the covenant, poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." The word covenant landed in that room like a stone thrown into still water. Every man reclining at that table had been raised on the words of the prophet Jeremiah, written 600 years earlier. "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, not like the covenant I made with their fathers. Jeremiah 31. The most quoted, most anticipated, most longed for promise in all of Jewish eschatology. And Jesus, holding a cup of diluted red wine in a lamplit room in the upper city, looked at 12 men and said, "This is it. This is the new covenant. It starts now. It starts with my blood." No one at that table fully understood what they were hearing. They could not have. But the words entered them like seeds entering soil, dormant for now, but alive, waiting for the rain of Pentecost to make them bloom. Between the breaking of bread and the singing of the final hymn, something happened that exposed the architecture of the room and the architecture of God's heart simultaneously. Jesus rose from the table. He removed his outer garment, his himation, the robe of a rabbi, the marker of his authority. He wrapped a lention, a servant's towel, around his waist, and he poured water into a basin. John uses the specific Greek word niptera, a copper or ceramic washing vessel found throughout first-century Judean homes, and he began to wash the disciples' feet. Here is what most people miss about this moment. Foot washing was not merely humble work. It was not simply a lowly task that a generous host might perform. The Babylonian Talmud, in Tractate Kiddushin, states explicitly that even a Jewish slave should not be required to wash feet, because the act was considered too degrading for an Israelite. It was the work of the lowest-ranking non-Jewish slave in a household, the absolute bottom of the social order. For Jesus to wash feet was not like a CEO mopping the floor. It was like a king cleaning a toilet with his bare hands while wearing the crown. It violated every category of status, authority, and dignity that the ancient world, Jewish and Gentile alike, held sacred. And he did it in silence, moving from couch to couch, cradling each dust-caked foot, pouring water over the cracked skin of fishermen and tax collectors and zealots, drying them with the towel he wore. The God who spoke the universe into existence on his knees, holding a basin. Peter objected. Of course Peter objected. Peter always understood enough to be horrified and never enough to be still. "You will never wash my feet," he said. And Jesus replied with words that contain the entire logic of grace. "If I do not wash you, you have no part in me." Salvation is not something you achieve by climbing toward God. Salvation is something you receive by letting God kneel in front of you. And that posture, that inversion, was so alien to everything Peter knew that he could barely endure it. If you have ever struggled to receive grace, if you have ever felt that you needed to earn God's love, to prove your worthiness, to climb high enough to deserve it, look at this room. Look at the basin. Look at the towel. God is not waiting for you at the top of a staircase. God is kneeling at the bottom, reaching for your feet. As the evening deepened, Jesus spoke of betrayal. He did not accuse. He did not point. He dipped a piece of bread, a somion, John calls it, a diminutive meaning a tiny morsel, a small scoop of matzah used to lift the bitter herbs and charosé to the mouth. And he handed it to Judas. In the Seder tradition, offering a dipped morsel to someone was a gesture of friendship, of honor. It was the host singling out a guest for special recognition. Jesus honored the man who was about to sell him for 30 pieces of Tyrian silver, about 420 grams, 120 denarii, 4 months of a laborer's wages, paid in coins that bore the face of the pagan god Melkart, because the temple that forbade graven images required payment in the only currency whose silver was pure enough for sacred use. The irony of those coins. The temple that served the God who said, "You shall have no other gods before me," demanded payment in coins stamped with Heracles. And 30 of those coins, those compromise coins, those contradiction coins, was the price of the one who would end the temple's purpose forever. Judas took the bread from Jesus' hand. He took the honor. he took the friendship, and John records, with a simplicity that has haunted readers for 2,000 years. And it was night, en de nuit, 3 words in Greek. John, who used darkness throughout his gospel as the signature of evil, the darkness that does not overcome the light, the night that falls when you reject the light, drops those 3 words like a door closing. Judas stepped out of the lamplight, out of the room where God was reclining on cushions and tearing bread with his hands, and he walked into the dark streets of Jerusalem. 600 meters, maybe 800, from the upper city to the palace of the high priest. A walk of perhaps 10 minutes through streets that smelled of roasting lamb and echoed with the singing of psalms from 100 rooftop seders. He walked through a city celebrating deliverance, on his way to deliver the deliverer. After Judas left, the room changed, like a room changes when a storm passes. The remaining 11 were now inside something they could not name, something between a farewell and a commissioning, something that felt like an ending and a beginning happening in the same breath. And Jesus spoke to them with a tenderness the Gospels had never recorded before, words that John alone preserved, 5 chapters of farewell discourse that scholars consider the most intimate self-revelation in all of Scripture. But before those words, and after the meal, came the final act of the Seder, the Hallel, the Psalms of praise. Psalms 113 and 114 had been sung before the meal. Now came Psalms 115 through 118, and Matthew records it with devastating understatement. When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Hymne Sanctis, they sang. 13 voices, no, 12 now, one had gone into the night, lifted the ancient words in that lamplit room, and the words they sang included Psalm 118, verse 22. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Jesus sang that. He sang it knowing that by tomorrow afternoon he would be that rejected stone. They sang, verse 17, I shall not die but live and declare the works of the Lord. He sang that too. He sang it knowing he would die and knowing he would live, and knowing both things were true simultaneously, in a way that no human voice had ever meant those words before. The last song before Gethsemane was a song about rejection becoming the foundation, about death becoming life, about the worst thing becoming the cornerstone of the best thing. He sang the ending before it happened, because the ending was written into the song 1,000 years before David's descendants carried it to the Temple Mount. They blew out the lamps. The room went dark. 20 small clay vessels releasing their last threads of smoke into the silence. The cushions still bore the impressions of 13 bodies. The table still held the remains of the meal. Crumbs of matzah, the stain of wine, the residue of carousel clinging to the edge of a stone dish. The basin of foot-washing water sat cooling in the corner. And they walked out, down the stone steps of the upper city, through streets still alive with the sounds of Passover, singing, laughter, the clatter of families cleaning up after the Seder, children finally sleeping. Down into the Kidron Valley, that dark cut between the city and the Mount of Olives, where the ancient tombs lined the rock face, and the night was so deep you could lose your footing on the path. And up again into the olive grove called Gethsemane. The word means oil press, the place where olives were crushed to release what was inside them. I want you to hold something before I let you go. Everything about this meal was layered. Everything meant more than it appeared. The unleavened bread was about Egypt, and it was about the body that would be broken. The wine was about redemption from slavery, and it was about the blood of a new covenant. The bitter herbs were about suffering in the past, and about suffering that was 12 hours away. The lamb on its pomegranate wood spit was about a night in Egypt when death passed over the houses marked with blood, and it was about a Friday afternoon when death itself would be passed over by the one whose blood marked the doorframe of the world. Every element of the Seder pointed backward to Exodus and forward to Golgotha. The entire meal was a hinge. the point where the oldest story in Jewish memory became the newest story in human history. And at the center of it all, reclining on a cushion in a room lit by 20 small flames, was a man who knew that by this time tomorrow, the lamps would be out, the bread would be gone, the wine would be dry, and his body would be in a borrowed tomb. He knew all of it, and he did not spend his last free evening in prayer alone, or in escape, or in fury at the one who would betray him. He spent it doing the things that love does when time is almost gone. He fed them, he washed their feet, he gave them words to hold on to in the dark. He sang with them. Tell me in the comments, when was the last time you sat at a table with bread and wine before you and remembered that the hands that broke it were the same hands that would be opened on a cross the next day? When was the last time the communion you took felt like what it was? A seat at this table, in this room, with these lamps and this bread and this wine and this God who would rather kneel with a towel than reign from a distance. The room on Mount Zion still exists, in a sense. The scenical, the traditional site, shows layers upon layers of construction, Crusader arches over Byzantine foundations over something older still. Epiphanius of Salamis recorded that when the Emperor Hadrian visited Jerusalem in 130 AD, nearly a century after the crucifixion, a small Christian church already stood on that spot. The memory held. The stones remembered what happened even when the city tried to forget, but the room that matters is not made of stone. The room that matters is made every time bread is broken and wine is poured, and someone says the words, "This is my body. This is my blood. Do this in remembrance of me." Every time those words are spoken, in a cathedral with 1,000 candles, or in a living room with a single lamp, in Latin or in Korean or in a language that did not exist when Jesus said them, the upper room reassembles itself around the table. The triclinium forms, the lamps are lit, and the one who reclined at the center of that U-shaped table is present again, tearing bread, pouring wine, kneeling with a basin, offering a morsel of honor even to the one who will wound him most. 2,000 years, and the bread is still being broken, the wine is still being poured, the words are still being spoken in every language on earth. No other meal in history has been repeated so many times in so many places by so many hands, exposed to every attempt to suppress it, to forget it, to dilute it, to explain it away, and it endures, because the meal is not a memory, the meal is a presence. The bread is still striped, the bread is still pierced, and the hands that break it are still the hands that were nailed for you, specifically you, personally you, with the full knowledge of your name and your failures and your longing for something you cannot quite articulate, but that feels, when you are honest, like homesickness for a table you have never sat at, but somehow recognize. You are invited to that table. You have always been invited. The place at his left is prepared, the cushion is laid, the lamp is lit, and the one who washed the feet of his betrayer is waiting to wash yours, not because you have earned it, not because you deserve it, but because that is what love does when it has run out of time and chooses to spend its last free hours kneeling. Come to the table. The bread is broken, the wine is poured, and the room is full of light. If this journey through the upper room opened something in you tonight, join us for what comes next. We are walking through every step of the final hours, from this room to Gethsemane to Golgotha, and what the evidence reveals at every turn will leave you breathless. Subscribe so you do not miss a single step of the road. The path goes down into the valley now. The oil press is waiting. And the night is just beginning.